Okay, so let's unpack this. It's August 9th, 1965, and it feels less like the birth of a nation and honestly much more like the first day of an apocalypse.
Yeah, that's a pretty accurate way to describe the mood.
Because you have to picture this, right? Singapore has just been completely abruptly kicked out of the Federation of Malaysia.
Unceremoniously evicted.
Exactly. So they are this tiny, low-lying sandbar at the very tip of the Malay Peninsula. They've got roughly 2 million people, zero natural resources.
Right, nothing to mine, nothing to sell.
And no agricultural hinterland to even feed themselves. The economy is totally fractured, and the international press is just having an absolute field day with this.
Oh, they were brutal.
Yeah, I mean, foreign journalists are openly publishing these Sunday editorials predicting their complete and total collapse.
Because they were isolated.
Yeah.
And the surrounding region was essentially a geopolitical powder keg at that point.
Right. Welcome to today's deep dive, by the way. We are super thrilled you're here with us because today we are looking at what has to be one of the most improbable survival stories of the 20th century.
It really is.
We're tracking the meteoric rise of Singapore from that terrified, super vulnerable island in 1965 to an undisputed first world economic powerhouse by the year 2000.
And we have some genuinely incredible source material to guide us through this.
Yes, we do.
We are working directly from excerpts of a first-hand account. This is the memoir From Third World to First by Lee Kuan Yew, who was the founding prime minister of Singapore.
And it is a wild read.
It gives us this totally uncompromising look inside the room, like the exact decisions, the psychological toll, and honestly, the highly unorthodox strategies they used.
So our mission today is basically to extract the ultimate playbook on crisis management and statecraft, because the question here transcends just history.
Definitely.
How do you build an entity from scratch when you have absolutely no army, no resources, and your immediate neighbors are actively rooting for you to fail?
It's the ultimate underdog scenario.
It really is. And so whether you are a startup founder trying to survive against industry giants, or maybe you're a manager trying to change a really toxic company culture, or you're just fascinated by these against all odds history stories.
This deep dive is your shortcut.
Yeah, it's a masterclass in extreme pragmatism.
Because it's a blueprint for taking your deepest vulnerabilities and literally weaponizing them into undeniable strengths.
So let's jump right into the immediate reality of August 1965. Because before you can even think about gross domestic product or housing,
You have to make sure you aren't going to be physically invaded.
right, you need a military. But Singapore had no real army of its own. They had exactly 2 infantry battalions, the 1st and 2nd Singapore Infantry Regiments.
And this is the part that is just so bizarre.
It absolutely blows my mind. Those battalions were under the direct command of a Malaysian brigadier, a guy named Syed Muhammad bin Syed Ahmad Al-Sagaf.
Yeah, Brigadier Al-Sagaf is this fascinating figure because he perfectly embodies this bizarre limbo that Singapore was stuck in.
He's technically in charge of a Malaysian brigade stationed right there on the island.
Right. And he did not behave like a guest. I mean, he carried himself as though he were still the absolute commander-in-chief of the territory.
Even though they were supposed to be independent.
On paper, sure, the separation happened on paper, but the physical reality of hard power, the guys with the guns, that hadn't shifted at all.
I mean, the audacity of the situation is just staggering. I'm looking at this incident in December 1965, so that's like 4 months after independence.
Right.
The first parliament of this brand new republic is due to open. And Al-Sagaf literally insists that his own Malaysian motorcycle outriders escort the Singaporean prime minister to the parliament.
It's basically a power move.
It's like getting kicked out of your house, but the landlord's armed guards are still sleeping on your couch, eating your food, and aggressively offering to walk you to your own kitchen.
That's a great analogy. And the psychological pressure of that moment, you really can't overstate it.
Because if you say yes,
Exactly. If the prime minister of a supposedly sovereign nation accepts a military escort from a foreign commander, he is signaling subordination to the whole world, and more importantly, to his own people.
but if he tells Al-Sagaf off, he risks provoking an immediate military coup.
That was the razor's edge they were walking on. The leadership back in Kuala Lumpur at the Malaysian capital, they could easily have just decided, separation was a mistake. Let's just reverse it by force right now.
Wow.
So Lee Kuan Yew had to swallow his pride, bite his tongue, and just accept the escort. He recognized that sovereignty is totally an illusion if you don't actually hold a monopoly on violence within your own borders.
And building that monopoly was so incredibly dangerous, not just because the Malaysians were watching them, but because their own internal ranks were an absolute powder keg.
Oh yeah, the racial tension was intense.
Which brings us to this terrifying moment in February 1966, the Shenton Way riot. Let me set the scene here for you. The newly formed defense ministry is looking at their recruitment numbers, and they realize something super alarming.
The demographics were totally skewed.
Right. 80% of the recent recruits to all units are Malay. And given the intense, violent racial tensions of the era between the Chinese majority and the Malay minority,
Having a military heavily skewed toward one specific demographic was seen as a massive internal security risk.
yeah, the context there is crucial. Race riots were a very recent, bloody memory for everyone on the island.
So the defense minister issues what seems like just an administrative order, basically temporarily freeze recruitment and training.
Just to pause and figure things out.
Exactly. The goal was to reassess the demographic balance and figure out how to integrate more non-Malays into the ranks.
But the army commander completely misinterprets the directive.
It's unbelievable.
He doesn't think it means pause recruitment. He thinks it means discharge all the Malay recruits.
Just fire them?
Yeah, so you have this Chinese major who gets the men together in the parade square at the headquarters. He tells the non-Malays to fall out of formation, and then he just summarily dismisses the Malay recruits on the spot.
It is the absolute worst possible way you could handle that kind of demographic tension.
I can't even imagine being in that courtyard.
The recruits were apparently just stunned into silence for a few minutes, but then the shock wore off and sheer bedlam just broke out.
It was explosive. The dismissed recruits turned on the non-Malay recruits. They attacked them with literally whatever they could find. Wooden poles, sticks, heavy glass aerated water bottles.
It was a full-on riot.
They started torching motorcycles. They overturned a van. And when a police patrol car and a fire engine rushed to the scene to try and intervene, the rioters attacked them too.
See, the danger here wasn't just a localized brawl at a military base.
What do you mean?
If word of this mutiny leaked out to the general public, that a Chinese major had unjustly fired all these Malay soldiers and a race riot had broken out at the military headquarters, it could have easily sparked massive island-wide racial violence.
It was a spark next to a powder keg.
Absolutely.
But the response to this crisis, I think it tells you everything you need to know about the leadership style of that time. Because the prime minister doesn't just barricade himself in a bunker and send an emissary.
No, he goes right to the center of it.
He personally drives down to the Criminal Investigation Department building where these rioters have been detained in this large quadrangle. He grabs a battery-powered megaphone, stands in front of these furious, violent men, and speaks to them directly in Malay.
Which is such a massive risk for a head of state to take.
Huge risk. But he explains that a catastrophic misunderstanding had occurred. He tells them the major was completely wrong, and he lays out the hard truth. Non-citizens would eventually have to find work back in Malaysia, but citizens could report back to camp the very next day.
He de-escalated the whole thing by providing immediate, authoritative clarity.
And it worked.
It did.
Wow.
The sheer relief of keeping their livelihoods literally brought cheers from the detainees. The riot was diffused, the spark was smothered, but the underlying vulnerability was starkly exposed for the leadership.
They realized they needed a disciplined, unified military, and they needed it yesterday.
But here's the crazy part. How do you actually build an army from scratch when your own population culturally despises the entire idea of being a soldier?
Right. The sources talk about this deep-seated cultural resistance among the Chinese majority. There was this ancient proverb that kind of dictated their worldview. Good steel does not become nails.
Meaning, a good, respectable young man does not become a soldier.
Exactly.
That stigma was a heavy legacy from Chinese history. Soldiers were often seen as little more than predatory bandits, or just pawns of corrupt warlords. Respectable families wanted their sons to be scholars or merchants or professionals.
The military was viewed as a dumping ground for the dregs of society.
So you have no trainers, your citizens culturally hate the military, and you can't exactly just ask the British for help.
Why not the British?
Because the British had spent decades training the Malaysian forces. Bringing them in might tip off Kuala Lumpur, or result in the British purposely building a weakened Singaporean force just to appease Malaysia.
Wow, so they were totally isolated. They had to look elsewhere, and the place they looked, it's just wild to me.
It really is.
They turned to Israel.
It was a wildly provocative choice.
Yeah.
But strategically, it actually made perfect sense.
How so?
Well, Israel was the only other newly independent, very small nation surrounded by much larger, hostile neighbors that had successfully built a formidable citizen army in record time.
But I have to pause you there because the geopolitics of this are just insane to me.
Oh, they were a nightmare.
If you look at a map of Southeast Asia in 1965, Singapore is completely sandwiched between Malaysia and Indonesia. Both are massive Muslim-majority nations.
Right.
And at this time, Indonesia is actively engaging in confrontasi, which is this policy of aggressive armed opposition against the whole formation of Malaysia. And the populations of both Malaysia and Indonesia deeply sympathized with the Arab and Palestinian cause. So if Singapore officially recognizes Israel and flies in IDF generals, aren't they basically just begging for their neighbors to invade, or at least inciting massive grassroots riots from their own Muslim population?
You've hit on the exact reason they had to operate in total, absolute secrecy.
It was that dangerous.
The diplomatic risk was astronomical. If the presence of Israeli military advisors became public knowledge, extremists in Malaysia and Indonesia would absolutely use it as propaganda to declare a holy war against Singapore.
And it would severely alienate Singapore's own Malay Muslim minority.
Right, so they had to resort to literal disguises.
This part is like a movie. In November 1965, this small team of Israeli military advisors, led by Colonel Jack Elazari, quietly arrives in Singapore.
Right, very quietly.
And because these men had dark hair and swarthy complexions, the Singaporean government issues this strict internal directive to refer to them exclusively as Mexicans.
The Mexicans.
Yeah.
It's an almost comical piece of Cold War-era espionage.
Yeah.
But the stakes were deadly serious.
Yeah, if it got caught, it's game over.
So these Mexicans were kept totally out of the public eye while they went to work designing a military infrastructure from the ground up.
But how could a handful of Mexicans actually build a military fast enough to matter? I mean, Malaysia was bound to figure it out eventually, right?
The Singaporean leadership knew secrecy had an expiration date. They just needed to buy enough time to build a credible deterrent. And the Israeli methodology was uniquely suited for extreme speed.
Because they didn't do things the British way.
Exactly. The British military model was glacial. It relied on centuries of tradition, sending officers off to Sandhurst, emphasizing spit and polish, perfect parade marching.
Or the pomp and circumstance of a colonial empire.
Exactly what Singapore did not have time for. So the Israelis discarded all of that. Their approach was a brutal crash course.
So how did it work?
Every single Israeli officer brought over was immediately paired with a Singaporean counterpart who just shadowed them. The focus was entirely on combat readiness, high motivation, and rapid mobilization.
No marching drills.
They weren't teaching men how to march beautifully. They were teaching them how to fight in the mud, how to communicate under actual fire, and how to operate armor and artillery.
And this leads to the birth of their total defense concept. Because they couldn't afford a massive standing professional army, so they institute national service, which is a mandatory military draft for all young men.
Yes. But the genius here is really how they framed it.
Yeah, they didn't just sell it as preparation for war. They engineered it as the ultimate tool for nation building. They deliberately set up cadet corps inside high schools.
That was a masterstroke of psychological engineering.
Because it normalizes it.
Exactly. They needed parents to associate military uniforms not with predatory warlords or British colonial enforcers, but with their own teenage sons. By putting uniforms on kids in a school setting, they localized the entire concept of defense.
And the national service itself became this great equalizer. It completely leveled the playing field.
It really did.
It didn't matter if your father was a wealthy bank executive, a government minister, or a street sweeper. Once you were drafted, you got the exact same haircut, you ate the exact same rations, you slept in the same unair-conditioned barracks.
And you suffered through the exact same grueling obstacle courses.
It physically forced different races, Chinese, Malay, Indian, and different religions to integrate.
Now, they were meticulously respectful of religious boundaries, like providing halal food for Muslims and avoiding beef for Hindus. But beyond that, everyone trained as one monolithic unit.
It completely rewired the society's cultural default. They practically erased that good steel does not become nails mentality within a single generation.
And the deterrent effect absolutely worked.
Yeah, the sources note that by 1969, Singapore was publicly parading French-made AMX-13 light tanks down the street during their National Day parade.
Which is an incredible image.
Tanks that they had secretly bought at a discount from Israel, reconditioned, and trained on without anyone knowing.
When the Malaysian political and military leadership saw those actual tanks rolling down the street on live television, the geopolitical dynamic shifted permanently.
The threat of a casual walk-in invasion just evaporated.
The deterrent was real. But, the cruel irony of statecraft is that the moment you secure your borders, the ground beneath your feet can still just fall away.
Right.
Just as the military deterrent was taking shape, Singapore was hit by a completely different kind of existential threat. The economic rug was pulled out from under them.
So let's transition from physical survival to economic survival. We really have to understand the sheer scale of what the British military presence meant to Singapore in the 1960s.
It was massive.
The bases weren't just a comfort blanket for security, they were the beating heart of the economy. British military expenditure accounted for a staggering 20% of Singapore's entire gross domestic product.
20%.
They employed tens of thousands of people directly as clerks and drivers and technicians, and tens of thousands more indirectly in retail, food, and support services.
It was an artificial economy, totally propped up by the defense budget of an empire that was rapidly declining.
And the British Prime Minister at the time, Harold Wilson, representing the Labour Party, he was facing immense domestic pressure back home.
Right. His backbenchers were basically demanding an end to these wildly expensive east of Suez military commitments. They wanted those funds redirected to domestic welfare programs, healthcare, and housing back in Britain.
Which makes sense for them. But Lee Kuan Yew saw this coming and desperately tried to stop it. He makes multiple frantic trips to London. He's lobbying Wilson, lobbying the Chancellor of the Exchequer, pleading with the Defense Secretary Denis Healey.
But the economic reality in Britain was just too grim. I mean, in 1967, the British government devalued the pound by over 14%.
Which was a catastrophic blow to Singapore, because a huge chunk of their national reserves were held in sterling in London.
In an instant, 14% of their wealth just vanished into thin air.
And then came the final nail in the coffin. In January 1968, the British formally announced a total military withdrawal by the end of 1971.
And the panic this triggered is really hard to fully capture. The foreign press essentially wrote Singapore's obituary right then and there.
There's this devastating quote in the sources from Cecil King, who was the chairman of the massive Daily Mirror group in the UK. He flat out told the Singaporean press secretary that the situation was hopeless.
Hopeless.
He saw a tiny island about to lose 20% of its GDP overnight, with mass unemployment looming and its security umbrella completely folding up.
In a crisis of this magnitude, the standard playbook for a newly independent, developing nation is pretty predictable.
What do they usually do?
You sound the alarm, you appeal to international sympathy, and you ask for massive foreign aid to bridge the economic gap. And the British, feeling a degree of post-colonial guilt, actually offered them significant aid to help soften the blow of their departure.
But this is where that extreme pragmatism kicks in again. The leadership looks at this offer of free aid and rejects the entire premise.
Yes.
The sources highlight this super pivotal observation Lee Kuan Yew made during a visit to Malta.
The Malta trip.
Yeah. Malta was another island nation, a former British naval hub, and they were navigating the exact same British drawdown. So Lee goes there to see how they are handling the transition, and what he sees absolutely terrifies him.
Because of the closure of the Suez Canal, the massive Malta dockyards were completely empty. There were no ships to repair.
But the dock workers were still clocking in.
Exactly. Still clocking in, still on full pay, entirely subsidized by British financial aid. Lee looked down into the dry docks and literally saw the workers playing water polo.
Playing water polo in an empty dry dock while their salaries are paid by a foreign government. It is a surreal, unforgettable image.
It really is.
And the Singaporean leadership looked at that and said, this is poison.
They recognized a profound psychological truth about human motivation. Foreign aid, if you rely on it as a crutch rather than a temporary scaffolding, it destroys the internal drive of a people.
It breeds a culture of entitlement.
And dependency. Lee went back and told his workers and the unions explicitly, the world does not owe us a living. We cannot live by the begging bowl.
I have to admit, when I first read that, it felt almost ruthlessly cold. I mean, you have tens of thousands of workers facing imminent unemployment, and instead of taking the free money to cushion their fall, you basically tell them, compete globally or starve.
It's a massive gamble on the resilience of your own people.
So harsh.
It was harsh, but they viewed it as the only sustainable path. So they demanded that the British hand over the military properties and assets to civilian management immediately, like before the troops even fully packed up.
They didn't want the infrastructure to rust while they debated what to do with it.
Right. They took the massive British naval dockyard at Sembawang, and instead of turning it into some subsidized state-run jobs program, they brought in a ruthless, commercial British firm, Swan and Hunter, to run it as a for-profit enterprise.
They converted the military airfields into civilian airports. The massive Royal Air Force Base at Changi eventually laid the groundwork for Changi International Airport.
And they took the island of Blaka Mati, which housed a Gurkha battalion, totally rebranded it, and transformed it into Sentosa.
Which is now a massive, multi-billion-dollar tourist resort.
Exactly. So by the time the British troops actually finished their withdrawal in 1971, the apocalyptic predictions just hadn't materialized. The 30,000 retrenched base workers had been largely absorbed into new, competitive industries.
But that begs an enormous question: what industries? You can't just mandate jobs into existence. Singapore had no domestic market.
Right, 2 million people is a neighborhood in Tokyo or New York. It's not an industrial consumer base.
And their neighbors in Malaysia and Indonesia were actively trying to bypass Singapore's ports to starve them out economically.
Yeah.
So how do you design an economy from absolute zero?
This is where we see a total paradigm shift in economic strategy. They brought in a Dutch economic advisor named Dr. Albert Winsemius, and together they developed a two-pronged strategy that openly defied all the conventional economic wisdom of the 1960s.
Okay, what were the two prongs?
The first prong was geographical: bypass the hostile immediate region and connect directly with the developed world, America, Europe, and Japan.
Just jump over your neighbors?
Leapfrog them entirely. And the second prong was conceptual: create what they termed a First World Oasis in a third world region.
A first world oasis. The framing is so brilliant, because if the entire region around you is unstable, plagued by corruption, crumbling infrastructure, and political violence, you differentiate yourself by becoming the one patch of land that is undeniably aggressively reliable.
And signaling that reliability required some very counterintuitive moves. Dr. Winsemius gave them a piece of advice that was incredibly symbolic.
A statue.
Yes, he told the leadership, do not, under any circumstances, take down the statue of Stamford Raffles.
For those who don't know, Stamford Raffles was the British colonial official who basically founded modern Singapore as a trading post in 1819.
Now, in the 1960s, a wave of decolonization is sweeping the globe. The visceral natural instinct of any newly independent nation is to purge the symbols of the colonizer.
Right. You rename the capital city, you change the street names, you put local heroes on the currency.
And you absolutely topple the bronze statues of the European men who subjugated you. It's the standard playbook for asserting nationalist identity.
But Winsemius argued that keeping the statue of Raffles standing proudly in the center of the city wasn't about bowing to the past. It was a psychological transmission to the future.
Precisely. It signaled to Western investors on Wall Street and in London, who were watching nervously to see if Singapore would succumb to some socialist revolution, that this new government respects its history.
It respects British institutions.
And most importantly, it reveres the rule of law.
It proved they weren't going to suddenly nationalize foreign assets or burn down foreign factories in a fit of post-colonial rage. It was a completely free, highly visible signal to global capital.
But a statue only gets investors to take a meeting. You have to actually close the deal.
Right, which brings us to the Economic Development Board, the EDB. The sources outline their fanatical dedication. This was the one-stop government agency created specifically to court foreign multinational corporations.
The EDB officers were essentially elite, state-sponsored salespeople, and they were legendary for their hustle.
Oh, the Hewlett-Packard story.
This is the best example of this. So HP was scouting locations for a new manufacturing plant. The EDB officers found out who the scout was, and they practically stalked him.
They anticipated his needs, solved his logistical problems before he even asked, and just overwhelmed him with competence until he agreed to recommend a site visit from the CEO, Mr. Hewlett himself.
But there was a massive problem. The site HP is considering requires them to lease the top 2 floors of a 6-story industrial building.
Okay.
But to run the heavy electronics manufacturing machinery, they need a massive electrical transformer to power the freight elevator. And the building simply doesn't have the power capacity yet.
And Mr. Hewlett is flying in for the site visit.
Right. So the EDB realizes that if this titan of American industry has to walk up 6 flights of stairs in the sweltering tropical heat,
he is going to leave, and the deal will die.
Instantly. Most bureaucracies would just apologize for the inconvenience and hope for the best.
But the EDB took a different approach. They literally ran a gigantic, heavy-duty electrical cable from a neighboring building draped it all the way across the gap, and wired it directly into their building's power grid.
Just so the freight elevator would work perfectly on the exact day Mr. Hewlett arrived.
It's amazing. He presses the button, the door is open, he glides up to the 6th floor, and the deal is signed.
It sounds almost comical, like a sitcom plot.
Yeah.
But that level of hyper-competent hustle became legendary in American boardrooms. Singapore proved they could deliver first-world problem-solving on demand.
And that hustle wasn't just confined to manufacturing electronics. They applied the exact same audacity to global finance, which leads us to one of the most brilliant macroeconomic maneuvers of the century, the invention of the Asian dollar market.
Yes, the time zone trick.
I love this part. So the story goes that Dr. Winsemius is having a conversation with an executive from the Bank of America, a guy named Van Onen.
Right.
They are looking at a globe tracing the flow of global capital, and Van Onen points out the structural inefficiency of the 1960s financial system.
Because the financial world wakes up in Zurich. As the day progresses, the action moves to Frankfurt, then to London. When London closes for the day, New York is open. New York trades, then hands over to San Francisco.
But when San Francisco banks close their doors at the end of the day on the Pacific coast, a veil just drops over the global financial system.
There's this massive multi-hour gap where essentially nothing happens. Global capital just goes to sleep until Zurich wakes up the next morning.
So Van Onen looks at the globe and realizes that if you place Singapore in that gap, you change the world.
Exactly. Singapore's geographic time zone is positioned perfectly. It can take the financial handover from San Francisco just before the U.S. closes, manage the capital markets through the Asian day, and then hold the market open just long enough to hand it right back to Zurich the next morning.
By inserting Singapore into that gap, they created, for the first time in human history, 24-hour, round-the-world global banking.
It's visionary.
But wait, recognizing the time zone is one thing, actually executing it is another. Singapore in 1968 was a third-world country. They didn't have a centuries-old central bank backing them up like the Bank of England, and they didn't have the institutional reputation of Wall Street.
Right.
Why would global banks part billions of dollars in a tropical swamp just because the clock's aligned?
Because Singapore offered them an irresistible regulatory environment. They couldn't rely on history, so they relied on agility. The government abolished the withholding tax on interest income earned by non-resident depositors.
They just wiped it out.
Completely. They exempted Asian dollar deposits from the statutory reserve requirements that normally strangle banks. They basically stripped away all the friction.
But I need to play devil's advocate here for a second, because if you look at the dominant economic theory of the 1960s and 70s, especially among developing nations, it was all about dependency theory.
Oh, absolutely.
The consensus among Marxist and anti-colonial academics was that multinational corporations, these massive MNCs from America and Europe, were essentially neo-colonial exploiters.
They were seen as the new empires.
Right. The fear was that if you invite foreign capital in, they will just extract your raw materials, exploit your cheap labor, siphon all the profits back to the West, and leave you totally impoverished. Weren't the Singaporean leaders terrified that they were just trading their old British colonial masters for new corporate ones?
That is the crucial philosophical pivot right there. If you look at Latin America or parts of Africa during that era, dependency theory was absolute gospel. Leaders closed their economies to protect themselves.
Right.
But Singapore looked at the theory and essentially laughed at it because the theory didn't apply to their physical reality.
Because they had nothing to extract.
Precisely. Singapore had a unique advantage in its profound disadvantage. There was no timber to chop down. There was no gold to mine. There were no oil fields for a foreign corporation to drain. All Singapore had was a sprawling population of hardworking but largely uneducated people.
So they made a brutally pragmatic calculation. They traded the only thing they had, cheap labor, for the things they desperately needed. High-tech training, engineering skills, and management know-how.
If Hewlett-Packard or Texas Instruments wanted to build electronics in Singapore just to save on labor costs, Singapore welcomed them with open arms.
Because in the process, Singaporean workers would get a paycheck, they'd learn how to assemble complex electronics, and eventually learn how to manage the factories themselves.
It was a massive state-sponsored transfer of human capital. It is the ultimate reality check. You can cling to a Marxist academic theory of anti-colonialism and let your people starve in ideological purity, or you can plug into the global capitalist grid, swallow your pride, and learn from the masters until you become one yourself.
And they fiercely protected the integrity of this financial oasis they were building. The sources note how incredibly rigorous the monetary authority of Singapore was in vetting who got to play in their sandbox.
The BCCI example is perfect for this.
Yes, Bank of Credit and Commerce International. In the 1970s and 80s, BCCI was an absolute behemoth. They had massive financial backing from Middle Eastern royalty, hundreds of branches worldwide, and really deep political connections.
Even the former British Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, wrote a personal letter trying to pressure Singapore into granting BCCI a banking license.
A personal letter from the Prime Minister. And despite the pressure, despite the royal backing and the VIP letters, Singapore repeatedly said no.
The regulators analyzed BCCI's books and felt the bank was aggressively undercapitalized, structurally opaque, and its reputation simply wasn't pristine enough for the Oasis.
And they were proven spectacularly right, because in 1991, BCCI collapsed in what was then the largest global financial fraud scandal in history. It cost depositors worldwide over $11 billion.
It was an absolute bloodbath.
But Singapore was completely unscathed because they refused to compromise their first world standards for short-term political favors.
But building this oasis of capital requires more than just tax breaks and elevator cables. Capital is notoriously cowardly. It flees at the first sign of instability.
Very true.
And in the 1960s, Singapore was deeply unstable at the street level. They were plagued by strikes, work stoppages, and riots.
Which brings us to arguably the most difficult part of the transformation, rewiring the social contract.
Yes.
Because to make this economic miracle work, the government had to totally break the culture of combative British-style trade unionism. The colonial legacy had left Singapore with unions that were highly militant.
The labor movement was deeply fragmented. You had communist factions controlling many of the grassroots unions, literally using strikes as political weapons to destabilize the state.
But even the non-communist unions had learned from their British advisors how to ruthlessly squeeze employers, entirely divorced from the reality of the company's productivity.
The text mentions practices that just seem insane today, like unions demanding triple pay on public holidays.
Oh, the street cleansing workers. The people employed to collect the garbage. They would deliberately engage in work slowdowns right before a major public holiday.
Just let the trash pile up in the tropical heat.
Rotting in the streets, just so the city would be forced to hire them on the holiday itself at triple their normal hourly rate to clean up the mess they had intentionally created.
It was essentially extortion by trash.
Extortion by trash. The leadership looked at this dynamic and realized it was a death sentence for foreign investment. No American or Japanese CEO is going to sink $50 million into a factory in a country where the workforce goes on a wildcat strike every other Tuesday or sabotages production to extort overtime.
The defining showdown over this culture happened in 1966 with a man named K. Suppiah.
Right. Suppiah was the president of the Public Daily Rated Employees Unions Federation. He represented the street sweepers, who are mostly immigrant laborers. Right before a major festival, Suppiah demands a massive wage increase and threatens a catastrophic strike.
And the government tells him no. They explain that under the law, the dispute is being sent to an industrial arbitration court, making any strike totally illegal.
But Suppiah ignores the law. He pulls 2,400 cleansing workers out on a wildcat strike immediately, and he threatens to pull 14,000 more workers off the job across the city if his demands aren't met.
Now, in most Western democracies at the time, the government would cave, or at least try to negotiate a middle ground to get the rotting garbage off the streets before the public rioted.
But the Singaporean government did the exact opposite. They met the strike with overwhelming, uncompromising force.
They arrested Suppiah and 14 other union leaders for calling an illegal strike. They initiated proceedings to deregister the union entirely.
And most dramatically, they declared that every single striker had effectively fired themselves.
It was a brutal display of state power. The government announced that if the strikers wanted to eat, they had to physically return to the depots the next morning and reapply for their old jobs.
It was pure shock and awe. The bluff was completely called. 90% of the strikers panicked, broke ranks, and reapplied for their jobs the very next day.
The union's power was totally shattered.
But the government didn't stop there. They pushed through sweeping new employment laws. They restored the right of management to hire, fire, and promote based on merit, not just union seniority. And they made it illegal to call a strike without a secret ballot.
That last point is crucial, because the secret ballot stopped union bosses from using intimidation tactics, forcing workers to raise their hands in an open room to vote for a strike just out of fear of violent reprisal.
Let's pause here, though, because this is where the pragmatism borders on authoritarianism. You cannot just crush unions, strip workers of their collective bargaining leverage, and rewrite the labor laws to favor corporations without offering the working class something profound in return.
Right. If you do that, you just engineer an exploited, furious underclass that will eventually burn the factories down.
The leadership knew they had to ensure the workers felt they were getting a tangible share of the new wealth.
But they looked at the models available to them, specifically the Western European model of the welfare state, and deeply rejected it.
They observed Britain's National Health Service, their generous unemployment benefits, and concluded that comprehensive welfare destroys the human drive to achieve.
They believed it incentivized stagnation.
So they opted for a highly unique philosophy, asset enhancement. And the mechanism they used is just brilliant. They took an old, dormant colonial institution called the Central Provident Fund, the CPF, and turned it into the ultimate tool of social and psychological engineering.
The CPF started under the British as a very simple, modest retirement savings account. But the newly independent government dramatically ramped up the mandatory contribution rates.
At one point, workers and their employers combined were forced by law to save up to 40, sometimes 50% of the workers' gross wages, locking it directly into this government-managed fund.
Just imagine the sheer political will required to do that. Imagine looking at your paycheck, and half of it is just gone, locked in a government vault that you can't touch.
In most countries, there would be riots in the streets.
Absolutely. But the government didn't just hoard the money to build monuments. They allowed citizens to use their CPF savings to pay the down payment and the monthly mortgage on government-built housing.
Which brings in the HDB, the Housing and Development Board. The government essentially terraformed the island. They cleared the sprawling, unsanitary squatter settlements and built massive, modern, high-rise apartment blocks.
And they used the CPF to make sure the workers could actually afford to buy them.
It is forced savings, gamified for national survival. They recognized a fundamental, primal, human truth. A man will not fight to defend a rented apartment block. He will just move.
But a man will fight to the death to protect a home that he holds the deed to.
By forcing them to save and funneling those savings into subsidized housing, they literally gave every citizen a concrete stake in the physical defense and economic success of the country.
The sociological transition, however, was incredibly turbulent. You were taking a largely rural population, used to living in kampongs, which are traditional villages with dirt floors and open spaces, and moving them into concrete high-rises in the sky.
The culture shock was massive. The anecdotes in the source material are simultaneously hilarious and totally chaotic.
Oh, the big farmers?
Yes. You have pig farmers moving into these modern apartments, and they literally cannot bear to part with their livelihood. So you have people trying to coax fully grown, squealing pigs up multiple flights of concrete stairs into their living rooms.
It's absurd.
Or you have a family of 14 moving in, and they bring a dozen chickens and ducks to live in the kitchen. They built a wooden gate across the hallway to keep the ducks out of the bedrooms, and the kids would take the elevator down to the ground floor to hunt for earthworms in the landscaping just to feed the poultry.
That is wild.
It took a decade of strict enforcement and education for the population to adjust to modern urban hygiene.
But the macroeconomic outcome was undeniable. Singapore eventually achieved a homeownership rate that topped 90%. Almost everyone had skin in the game. And the government applied this exact same philosophy of forced savings and personal responsibility to the healthcare system.
And to save.
Right. Instead of providing free, universal healthcare for all, which they firmly believed would lead to what they called the buffet syndrome, they forced people to save a specific percentage of their income into a dedicated medical account.
The buffet syndrome is such a brilliant behavioral economics concept. If the buffet is free, people will pile their plates high with food they don't even want just because they can.
If healthcare is entirely free at the point of access, people will consume endless medical resources, demanding expensive tests and treatments for minor ailments, bankrupting the state.
The sources prove this with a pilot program they ran. The government tried giving out free antibiotics at state clinics. Patients would take the pills for 2 days, feel a little bit better, throw the rest of the expensive medication in the trash, and then inevitably get sick again a week later. Human nature.
Exactly. When the government changed the policy and started charging just 50 cents for a clinic visit and the medication, everything changed. Suddenly, because the patient had paid for it out of their own pocket, they valued the medicine and took the full course.
Medicine ensured that every citizen always had money available for a hospital emergency. But because it was fundamentally their money, drawn from their own account, they were highly incentivized not to waste it on unnecessary procedures.
It was a system intricately designed to prevent the burden of the current generation's healthcare from falling onto the taxpayers of the next generation.
The sources conceptualize this entire societal structure using the metaphor of yin and yang. And the analysis of this is fascinating.
How does it work?
Yang represents the male, competitive, harsh, free market reality. If you build a society entirely on yang, you get absolute brutal capitalism, a winner-takes-all Thunderdome with a few ultra-wealthy billionaires and a massive, angry, exploited underclass.
But yin represents the female, the solidarity, the nurturing element. If a society leans too heavily on yin-like, a pure, overly generous welfare state, the population loses its edge. The motivation to excel dissipates, productivity plummets, and the economy stagnates.
So Singapore engineered a deliberate balance. The job market was pure yang. Brutal, global competition, no minimum wage, no safety net for laziness. Work hard, upgrade your skills, or starve.
But the housing market in the CPF was the yin, forcing you to save, heavily subsidizing the construction of high-quality apartments, and virtually guaranteeing that if you participated in the system, you would own a tangible piece of the First World Oasis.
But we have to understand that none of this, the housing, the foreign investment, the labor reforms, happen in a vacuum. While they're laying electrical cables for Hewlett-Packard and trying to get pigs out of apartment stairwells, there is a literal existential political war happening in the streets.
The greatest threat to Singapore's survival in the 1960s wasn't just foreign militaries or withdrawing British troops. It was a deeply entrenched internal insurgency.
We have to talk about the political battlefield and the communist collapse. The Communist United Front had a massive, profound psychological and organizational grip on the Chinese-speaking population of Singapore.
They weren't just a fringe group. They believed, with near religious fervor, that communism was the inevitable historical wave of the future, backed by the sheer, looming mass of Mao Zedong's China just to the north.
The communist political wing in Singapore, operating legally as the Barisan Socialist Party, was a formidable machine. They were disciplined, dedicated, and deeply embedded in the working-class neighborhoods.
But then, they made what historians consider one of the most catastrophic unforced errors in modern political history.
When Singapore becomes an independent republic in 1965, the chairman of the Barisan Socialist, Dr. Lee Siew Chow, makes a fatal miscalculation. He publicly declares that the independence is phony, that is just a neo-colonial plot by the British and the ruling party, the People's Action Party, or the PAP.
And to protest this phony independence, he orders his members of parliament to completely boycott the newly formed sovereign parliament.
He abandoned the constitutional arena.
Completely. But he went further. Trying to aggressively mimic the Red Guards who were tearing China apart during Mao's Cultural Revolution, Dr. Lee orders his followers to take the battle directly to the streets.
They start mounting illegal disruptive protests, they march through night markets, they clash violently with the police, they burn effigies, and this strategy completely spectacularly backfires.
Because the people of Singapore in 1965 were exhausted and terrified. They had just been kicked out of Malaysia, the British economy was evaporating, and their literal survival was on the line.
The average citizen didn't want ideological street battles. They wanted a job, a home, and stability.
The Barisan's own members of parliament recognized the folly. They started resigning in disgust, publicly stating that the party leadership was prioritizing the abstract goals of international communism over the actual material well-being of the people of Singapore.
By boycotting parliament, the Barisan Socialists literally handed the ruling party Lee Kuan Yew's PAP absolute, unchecked legislative power. They walked off the field and left the PAP to write the rules of the game for decades to come.
A huge, unforced error.
But I have to push back on the narrative here. Did the PAP just get incredibly historically lucky that their main opposition self-destructed so spectacularly? Or did the government actively engineer this total dominance?
It is always a mixture of luck and ruthless capitalization. The opposition's boycott was a historical gift, but the PAP did not just sit back and watch them implode. They methodically engineered dominance at the grassroots level.
Right.
They deeply understood why the communists were popular. The communists derived their power from incredibly tight, highly functional community networks.
If you were a poor immigrant in the 1950s or 60s and you wanted to learn to read or you wanted to learn how to fix a radio to get a better job, you went to the communist-run community center.
Exactly. They ran sewing clubs, alumni associations, and night classes. They provided actual, tangible utility to the working class.
So the government realized that you cannot defeat an ideology with just police raids. You have to outcompete it on the ground.
So the government created a massive statutory board called the People's Association, and they systematically built hundreds of state-run community centers across every single neighborhood.
They legally mirrored the communist network. They provided the exact same services, subsidized literacy classes, cooking workshops, electronics repair, sports facilities.
They out-resourced and out-organized the communists at the street level. They won the loyalty of the masses not just through anti-communist speeches, but by providing better daily benefits.
And the human toll of this ideological war is deeply sobering. The source material details the tragic trajectory of a man named Lim Chin-siang. In the 1950s, Lim was the charismatic, brilliant, undeniably powerful leader of the Communist United Front.
He was a phenomenal orator who could mobilize hundreds of thousands of workers. Because he was viewed as a supreme threat to the state, he had been detained without trial by the government.
In 1965, while sitting in a prison cell, the world changes around him. The international communist movement fractures. He is isolated from his former comrades who are tearing each other apart over ideological purity.
He realizes the cause he dedicated his entire life to is fundamentally failing.
The psychological break is so profound that he attempts suicide by hanging himself with his own pajamas in a prison bathroom.
He survived the attempt, but the revolutionary fire was extinguished. He was completely broken. He eventually formally renounced communism, was released from detention, and went into a quiet, obscure exile in London.
Decades later, when he passed away, the sheer tragedy of his life, a man of immense brilliance and passion who bet everything on the wrong side of history, was openly acknowledged even by his most bitter political adversaries.
And then the text provides another story that feels like it was ripped straight out of a Cold War spy thriller, the story of the Plen.
Oh, wow, the Plen.
The Plen, which was short for plenipotentiary, meaning an envoy with full powers, was the top, shadowy underground communist leader in Singapore. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, he would arrange secret meetings with Kuan.
They would meet in unlit, uncompleted buildings in the dead of night, where the Plen would try to negotiate, threaten, or form tactical alliances. He was a terrifying, elusive figure who commanded a vast, underground network of operatives.
The contrast the memoir provides here is deeply cinematic. Fast forward 3 decades to 1995. The world has entirely changed. The Soviet Union has collapsed. Singapore is a glittering, wealthy, first world metropolis.
And Lee Kuan Yew is in Beijing.
Yes. Staying at the luxurious Diaoyutai State Guest House as an honored, highly sought-after VIP guest of the Chinese Communist government, who are now eager to learn from Singapore's capitalist success.
And who requests a private meeting at the guest house. The Plen. The Plen, who is now an elderly, exiled man living in China, wants to see if he and his few remaining exiled comrades can finally return home to Singapore to die in peace.
The irony is just dripping from the walls of that room.
Lee Kuan Yew, the ultimate capitalist pragmatist who the communists spent decades trying to destroy, is being treated like royalty by the Chinese government, offering the Plen top-shelf, state-provided Maotai liquor.
And the Plen, the formerly terrifying revolutionary who once sought to orchestrate the violent overthrow of the state, just quietly sips plain Chinese tea and asks for a favor from the victor.
It perfectly encapsulates the finality of the geopolitical shift. The Plen tries to leverage their old, shared history, asking for generosity and a quiet return. But the response he gets is pure, unsentimental statecraft.
Lee tells him that if he wants to return to Singapore, the rules are non-negotiable.
Yeah.
He must completely, publicly cut ties with the Communist Party. He must make a full, detailed disclosure of his past activities to the Internal Security Department.
He must, in essence, totally surrender to the authority of the state. There was no romantic reconciliation between old foes. The state had won, the insurgency was dead, and the rules of the First World Oasis applied to everyone.
It is the ultimate triumph of extreme pragmatism over rigid ideology. And that brings us full circle on this incredible journey.
Let's pull back and look at the whole board. We started in August 1965. A vulnerable, terrified sandbar, expelled from its hinterland, guarded by foreign troops who might turn into occupiers, and economically reliant on a British military base that was about to vanish into thin air.
And through a series of almost impossibly bold pragmatic decisions, they flipped the script entirely. They weaponized their vulnerability.
They secretly built an army with the help of the Israelis to establish an undeniable physical deterrent.
They point-blank refused the begging bowl of foreign aid, opting instead to frantically pivot and convert their military infrastructure into highly competitive commercial shipyards and airports.
They leapfrogged their hostile, unstable neighbors to plug directly into the global grid. They laid out the red carpet and the elevator cables for American and European multinational corporations, offering them a highly disciplined, relentlessly reliable First World Oasis.
They invented the time zone trick to single-handedly create a 24-hour global banking system.
They crushed militant unionism, rewriting the labor laws to favor productivity. But they balanced that harshness by forcing their citizens to save up to half their income to buy their own apartments, literally giving everyone a concrete stake in the physical and economic defense of the nation.
And they ruthlessly out-organized their internal political rivals, utilizing the massive unforced errors of the communists to build an unbroken era of political stability that allowed the capital to flow freely.
For anyone listening, whether you are charting the course of a massive corporation, building a startup from zero, or just trying to navigate your own career, the masterclass here is about how you view your disadvantages.
Singapore didn't succeed in spite of having no natural resources, no domestic market, and hostile neighbors. They succeeded because those exact vulnerabilities forced them to become undeniably, relentlessly essential to the rest of the world.
They couldn't rely on oil or timber to save them, so they had to rely on being the most efficient, reliable, and educated node in the global network. It's a powerful testament to human capital.
It really is.
But it also leaves us with a lingering, provocative question for our modern era. Think about the core geographic strategy we discussed today: leapfrogging. When their immediate neighbors were hostile or economically stagnant, Singapore survived by culturally and economically leapfrogging right over them, bypassing the local hostility to connect directly with America, Europe, and Japan.
But consider the world we are stepping into today. We are living in a deeply complex, increasingly fragmented global system. Supply chains are aggressively regionalizing. Digital borders and firewalls are becoming as formidable as physical ones.
So the question is, if a small nation, or even an innovative company today, finds itself ostracized, blocked, or in a hostile environment with its immediate geographic or digital neighbors, is leapfrogging still practically possible?
That's a great question.
Can you still just bypass your region to find global friends? Or has the world fractured and regionalized so much that we are all, for better or worse, entirely dependent on the goodwill and the economics of the people right next door?
Can you still build an isolated oasis? Or is the global climate changing too fast for any one island to survive alone? It is a complex question of geographic destiny in a deglobalizing world.
A phenomenal question to leave you with. We started this deep dive talking about the paralyzing dread of building something from scratch where the blueprint is shredded and the international press is writing your obituary. Singapore proved that you don't need a perfect blueprint if you have the sheer will to adapt, the absolute pragmatism to accept hard truths over comfortable theories, and the audacity to lay an elevator cable for a single guest. Thank you for joining us in the deep dive. We'll see you next time.